right. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started on our mini review session. So this morning's mini review session is on energy metabolism and body composition. I'm Mary Ellen Harper from the University of Ottawa, and my co-chair is Jennifer Cook from York University. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker this morning. Our first speaker is Ian Patton. He is one of the members of our Patient Engagement Committee members, and I'd like to invite him to share his personal perspectives on this topic. Mr. Patton is involved in the public engagement strategy, and he has worked with an obesity expert and lived as an obese person. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ian Patton to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. Do I pull up my slides myself? Or? Just bear with me a second here. All right, there we go. How's everyone doing this morning? Not bad. All right. So I'm taking a little bit of a different twist with my personal story this time, so bear with me if I read a little bit more than I like to, but hopefully we'll have some fun. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I've been given the task of sharing with you my personal experiences with obesity. I really believe that this is an important practice for all of us, because when I was sitting in your chair, I found it very easy to uncouple the science and the research from the individual personal experiences that some of us face. So this is a good practice, and I hope you guys take a little something away from it. If you do take anything away from today, I hope that you're going to be a little bit more mindful of the target audience you're working for or working with. We truly appreciate everything that you guys do for us in your work, but we're people. We're not patients, numbers, or research statistics. So first thing I have to do is make my disclosure statement. No one pays me anything, so I have no conflicts of interest. All right, away we go. So for those that don't know me, I do have a background in training in kinesiology. So I got a PhD in kinesiology with my focus being on physical activity and childhood obesity. I then went on and did a postdoc on body mass index in children. And I currently am a contract faculty member at York University in the kinesiology department. I also do a little bit of teaching at Loyalist College. But if I'm going to be honest with you, that's not who I identify as anymore, or at least not as much as I used to. First and foremost, I'm a father. So this is the greatest privilege that was ever given to me. And here you got my son Declan on the left and my daughter Sawyer on the right. And I don't bring this up because I want to brag about how cool my kids are, and they are pretty cool. But it's relevant because everything I do, including standing here today, is to make the world a little bit better for them. I want to make a little bit of change, and I don't want them to experience what I did. So when I had my son, it was a little bit of a wake-up call for me, like it is for a lot of us who are dealing with obesity. It's kind of that moment where you're like, I gotta sort this out. I kind of had this mindset that if I could fix myself, if I could lose the weight soon enough, he would never remember me as Fat Dad. I never wanted him to remember the horrifically swollen version of myself that I saw myself as. So I figured I had about 3 or 4 years before those memories really stuck with him. So I worked really hard and I lost a bunch of weight. It all came back. The yo-yo that we all experience. I realize now that mindset I had was a little bit dysfunctional. And I've changed the mindset that I never want my kids to have the dysfunctional relationship with their body that I did. I want them to grow up in a world where body diversity is accepted and clinical obesity is treated with the dignity and vigor of any other chronic disease. So, this is me pre and post-op. So the guy on the left there was well over 350 pounds, hypertensive, severe sleep apnea, probably a little bit depressive, and not very productive. Guy on the right, don't have hypertension medication anymore, don't have to deal with my CPAP machine anymore, and I am much more productive, and probably most importantly, I'm a better husband and father. Okay. I also identify strongly as a member of the Canadian Obesity Public Engagement Committee that we have going on here. We've been here since Sunday. We've been doing a lot of work, and we've got some really interesting things coming down the line, so I encourage all of you to join us on that journey. Our mission is to build a vibrant community to empower people living with obesity. Empower them to feel comfortable and safe, seeking the help that they need, empowering them to have the evidence-based information they need, and empowering them to have a voice. We've kind of hijacked a phrase that we've heard, and it's nothing about me without me. And it means that we need to be involved in every step along the way. And I kind of equate this to the pedagogy of my teaching practice. I find that when I employ a student-centered approach to teaching, the uptake and effectiveness of my teaching improves exponentially. So too will a patient-centered approach to what you guys do. And if I can give you guys an example, one way that we can help is with that knowledge translation piece. If we are involved all along in every step in your practice or your research, we can turn around and with our outreach and advocacy, spread the word much faster and to a much larger audience than a publication. So, I call my struggle, my relationship with weight a struggle because that picture on the left is truly how it feels. It's an uphill battle and almost feels impossible to win. It's a bit unfair. Our bodies are magnificent and efficient survival machines. Weight loss that we perceive as beneficial and positive, our body sees it as a risk and triggers survival mechanisms that try to remedy the change. Now, many of you have heard Marty talk earlier this week and tell his story. It's shocking and powerful, and I can tell you that each and every one of us that deal with this disease have our own unique story. Many of you guys recognize this slide. It's all the factors that affect obesity, and looking at this, it hurts the brain. But I think it also makes it clear that there are no two cases of obesity that are the same. We all have a unique and complex interaction with these factors. I grew up in a loving home with a loving family. I have very strong relationships with all my family members. Reflecting back, our nutritional habits as a family at times were questionable, but not overly terrible. What was difficult for me was that the food had a much different effect on me than it did anyone else in my family. By grade 2, I was fully aware that I was defective. I was the fat kid in school, and I got bullied accordingly. The first time I took a beating at school, I did what you're supposed to do. I went and I told the teacher. But because they didn't see the assault, because they didn't see the assault, it was my word against theirs, and it was an unpunishable offense. I got no protection in my school from the people that I needed protection from. So, my dad, being the hero that he is, taught me a very important life lesson, and that was to protect yourself and not let anyone ever hurt you. He went to the school, sat down with the principal and the vice principal, and he essentially said, listen, if you guys aren't going to do anything about it, Ian's going to take care of it himself. So, in grade 2, one bully corrected with a bloody nose, and things changed for me drastically. Bullies became friends, and I was able to cope. Unfortunately, I can't teach that same lesson to my son now, because if I did, I'd be in jail, and my son would be expelled. From that point on, I dealt with my weight through sport. I seeked out and excelled in sports where my size was a benefit and actually revered in some cases. Nicknames like Moose or Tank replaced Fatty or Tubby, or my favorite, Fat and Patton. I got creative. And that's not to say that the hurt and discrimination didn't exist for me. but it wasn't the blatant and tragic abuse that you guys heard from Marty the other day. Mine was more like a death of 1,000 cuts, and each one was just a tiny little nick. I still got bullied, but in most cases I was smarter, stronger, and just a little bit crazier than the bully. It was known to be a mistake to bully me. What really hurt for me was the discrimination and shame brought on by those closest to me, or those in power. For example, I had a teacher in elementary school. For a couple years, there was numerous occasions where I dealt with him making fat jokes in front of my peers about me. Even family members. I love my father, and he is a wonderful role model. I actually model how I parent my own kids very much off of my father. But there are some things that stick out, and I don't think he ever intentionally intended to harm me, and there was nothing malicious about it, but there were certain words and interactions that stuck out. For example, he had a favorite joke when we traveled as a family. As we sat on the plane on the tarmac waiting to take off, he would tell this joke every single time, without fail. And he did it loud enough so that everyone could hear it. And essentially the punchline went that they shouldn't put me and my younger brother together on the plane. He also had a little bit of a weight problem. They shouldn't put us together on the plane because if they did, we'd just go in one big circle. Family would laugh, strangers would laugh, even the stewardesses would laugh, and me and Mike would just kind of grin and bear it. I continued to be the fat kid in class all through high school. Sports were my sanctuary. I excelled in Olympic-style wrestling. Now in wrestling, like many combative sports, the idea is to be as big as possible while still making the desired weight class. So we employed a strategic method called weight cutting. And if any of you know anything about it, I look back on it, it's dangerous and stupid. Heavyweight was my weight class. It was either 286 pounds or 265 pounds, depending on the tournament that I was entering. It was common practice and expected and actually encouraged that you cut weight. So on a weekly basis, I would be walking around 300 pounds. That was my walking weight while I was competing 2 hours a day, training, doing runs, going to the gym. I was 300 pounds. But I needed to weigh in at 286 pounds. So Thursday morning, I had started my deprivation. I would eliminate food, and I'd start restricting my water intake. Still going about my day, training, going to practice, work, school, all that stuff. Fridays were a complete dehydration day. No fluid intake whatsoever until weigh-ins at 4 p.m. The idea was to sweat out the last 8 to 10 pounds by running and doing stairs in an obscene number of layers of clothes. After weigh-ins, the team would routinely go for a post-cut binge at Eastside Mario's, where we had unlimited breadsticks and pasta. It was a weekly routine. Cut weight, make weight, gain weight. Cut weight, make weight, gain weight. By the time I stepped on the mat the next morning, I was easily back up to close to my 300 pounds. So it's essentially a way of kind of cheating within the rules, where if your weight class says you're 265 pounds or whatever, you're actually wrestling and you're 290 pounds. And it's very common in combative sports. Making 265 was a little bit more difficult, as you can imagine. I still walked around at 300 pounds. I essentially did something similar, but I would start my deprivation probably the week before a little bit, or really heavily on the Monday before the Friday weigh-in. As long as by Friday morning I could get my weight within that 10-pound range, I knew I was fine. However, because this was so draining throughout that week, I wasn't able to do my sweat runs. So instead, I would sit in a sauna and peel the sweat off me with a credit card so that my body would have to produce more sweat. 1.5 hours later, I made weight. Miserable, non-functional, but on weight. A binge, and the next morning, back up to 290 pounds and ready to compete. I look back now and I can imagine that this probably had a pretty significant part of my journey with my weight, and it probably irreversibly damaged my metabolism. A back injury kept me off the mats, and the weight skyrocketed. Before my surgery, I actually felt like the fat was sucking the life out of me. I woke up one morning and, not joking, honestly felt that this was the day that it was going to kill me. I was going to die. I didn't. I'm here. I run 5Ks. I'm a better husband, better father. I'm a way better teacher than I was. And I'm much more comfortable with my journey. I still struggle. I have to be diligent. I have put weight back on post-op. I've gotten that under control and managed it. But I will never be rid of this disease. It's something I'm going to be struggling with forever. Thanks for listening.
Thanks to Dr. Patton for that very heartfelt story about all the struggles that he had. So we're going to change gears now and talk about the physiological determinants of energy metabolism. The first speaker this morning is Dr. Eric Doucette. Dr. Doucette is a professor at the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa. His research program focuses on specifically on understanding the contribution of physiological and endocrine factors to variations in energy balance and body weight regulation. He serves as the editor for the British Journal of Nutrition, the Journal of the Nutrition Society, the Journal of Obesity, and Frontiers in Physiology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Doucette.
All right, I just have to pull up my presentation here. While I'm doing so, I'd like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to come and stress out in front of a large group of my peers this morning. Not a morning guy for those of you who know me, so bear with me here for a second. There it is. So I was asked to give a talk in and around the determinants of energy expenditure, energy metabolism, but I decided to kind of change it a bit because I thought it was a bit more interesting and actual. So I'm going to be presenting stuff in and around the rationale why we would think that fast weight loss would be, or slow weight loss, actually causes differences in the way that energy expenditure is regulated. To start, I would like to bore you with a long list of funding. Unfortunately, given the current landscape, there's not a lot that I can tell you about. So, because this is a mini review, I've decided to focus on recent references. As you can see, I'm starting with this one dating back to 1932. This is, to me, one of the steeple research that we need to take into account when you're looking at the effects of body weight on energy expenditure. This is Max Kleiber's work describing what is called the allometric relationship between weight and the amount of energy that you burn. So it's basically, if you look at it in a different way, it looks like this, meaning that the smaller you are, the greater the amount of energy you need to expend to maintain body temperature. And if I made the analogy I often use in class when I present this is, and this is the relationship of surface to mass ratio. So if you break up a piece of ice in multiple pieces, what you realize is it melts a lot faster than when you have the entire cube, which is intact. And it's basically the same thing that we see with energy expenditure. You need, if you're a small mammal, to maintain heat content, you need to produce a lot more. Hence the relationship that we often hear about when we look at energy expenditure and body mass. And this is the relationship that most of you have likely seen before. It dates back to the 80s, and it's a very tightly knitted relationship between, in this particular case, fat-free mass, measured likely with underwater weighing at the time, and daily energy expenditure measured inside a metabolic chamber. So the corollary of this observation, obviously, if you look at this, people with higher mass have higher energy expenditure. People with lower mass have lower energy expenditure. And you've known this. So you would expect, as someone is either gaining or losing mass, their energy expenditure will be either increasing or decreasing. Proportionally so, because this is a pretty tight relationship, as you can see. Here I'm presenting some data that support actually what I was just saying, and it's a recent publication from Manfred Mueller, current editor of the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, that shows they basically did, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Minnesota semi-starvation study, but they revisited that study and redid it in a much shorter fashion to maybe highlight, I don't know if there's a pointer in this, oh, there is. So what you have here, I'm shaking because I always have a lot of coffee in the morning, especially when it's this early. So what you have here is there's an overfeeding period followed by a deprivation period and then a refeeding period. And what you have here are the fluctuations in body mass and urinary nitrogen excretion, so nitrogen balance. This is energy expenditure, and not surprisingly, according to what I've just showed to you, what you have is your baseline energy expenditure. This is the first overfeeding period that you have here. Energy expenditure goes up, and as body weight goes down, you have a progressive decrease in energy expenditure. Again, everything that I've just said to you is actually exemplified on the slide. And during the overfeeding phase here, what you have is a rebound of energy expenditure. Up to now, everything is fine. There seems to be this really nicely regulated relationship between mass and energy expenditure. Now, if you look closely at the data, and this is where the notion of metabolic adaptation comes in, something I'm sure most of you have heard about, whereas if you deprive someone of their energy, and Ian actually alluded to these biological systems that set in when you're trying to reduce energy stores. And what you actually see is if you make what is called a comparison between measured energy expenditure and the actual prediction of the change. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, what we do normally to calculate what a metabolic adaptation is we take a prediction equation based on mass and age and sex most of the time, and you predict what the energy expenditure for that specific person would be. Then you compare that prediction to what the actual measure is, and you get what is called here, on this portion of the graph, what is called the metabolic adaptation, the greater than predicted decrease in energy expenditure, or adaptive thermogenesis. And you can see that as you're overfeeding people, energy expenditure is slightly greater than it should be for mass, and as you're reducing body mass, energy expenditure then falls more than it actually should based on the changes of energy stores. And again, recent data, but I think this is one of the really cool studies that has looked at this, often overlooked in the literature, by Miller and Parsonage way back when in 1975, published in the Lancet of all journals, not too shabby. And what they did here is a lot of this study was done on women. And they were claiming, some of them, that they could not lose weight. So what they did, they thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to try and test some of our concepts here. So they locked them up in the farmhouse for 3 weeks so they could control every speck of food that was going into these individuals. And they measured resting energy expenditure on a daily basis to see what was going on. So they very closely monitored the energy restriction, and then they controlled it and measured the outcomes, which in this particular case was energy expenditure. And what they realized very quickly is that after a few days, what you see here, just to walk you through the slide, this is the number of people or number of women, and this is their variations in BMR or basal metabolic rate. And you see that some, and I wouldn't say fortunate, I won't label it fortunate or unfortunate, some responses are actually positive. Some people will actually see slight increases in energy expenditure for whatever reason, probably not well understood under such circumstances, but for the most part, what you have is major decreases in energy expenditure. And in fact, you'll have individuals at the left end of the spectrum that will have decreases up to 45% of their BMR. There's only one of these individuals, but there's at least 3 that are in the range, if you look at this, 3 or 4, in the range of 25 to 30% of their BMI within a few days of energy restriction. If you're wondering what that means, it means that if you set an energy restriction at 30%, they're no longer losing weight, right? Because you've swallowed up the entire deficit. So there is likely cases, for those of you who have practice, where this could happen. You would have people come into your office seeking weight loss, you put them on an energy-restricted diet, and within a short period of time, they're not losing weight. Not because they're not being compliant, it may be because they're overly compliant to the prescription, right? We've looked at this way back when I was young and fresh, doing my PhD about 2 years ago. No, seriously. So what you have here is, in men and women, the actual prediction of the decrease after 2 weeks, 8 weeks, and 15, 17 weeks of a weight loss program. You have the same in women. And this is the actual measured decrease in the lower end of this graph. So what you see again is a greater than predicted decrease. But what's kind of interesting with this particular slide, at least interesting to me, I should mention that, is that when at this portion of the trial, so near the end here, these guys were weight stable in energy balance. They were no longer under dietary restriction. So they slightly increased their intake, and as they're increasing their intake, you kind of see, and I'm not saying this is significant by any means, but you kind of see a rebound of the metabolic adaptation. Kind of, I guess, we could speculate to say, well, there might be an effect of the magnitude of the deficit that plays a role in regulating this metabolic adaptation. And that's what we want to be, or want to be talking about today. I kind of worked on this slide yesterday, and it's been a really furnished summit, so I might not be getting everything. What I'm saying is I maybe was drunk when I did this. So this is my conception of the regulation of energy expenditure, and those of you who know me actually probably know this is true what I'm saying. So, so this is how I see body weight and energy expenditure as you're gaining weight. So as you're gaining weight, I think that energy expenditure plays catch up. So your weight increase is actually quicker than your energy expenditure, and eventually energy expenditure will match your body weight, and the price to be paid under those circumstances is that now you're carrying more potential energy. So energy, the only thing really, physiologically speaking, protecting you against weight gain is a sluggish rise in your energy expenditure because you're carrying more and more body mass. Again, along the lines of that relationship that we discussed earlier. As you're losing weight, it's kind of different. So you lose weight, and what you see is this drastic downshoot of energy expenditure that never actually goes back to meeting up with body weight. Hence, again, putting in numerical terms some of the struggles that were identified earlier as people are struggling to try to maintain weight loss. I don't know what happened here. What button? I'll wing it. I maybe stepped on the cable. So have you guys heard the joke about the... Yes, thank you. So I'll kind of go back. So the question really is the modulation of the difference between actual measurements of energy expenditure and the predicted, so this metabolic adaptation, is it modulated by the amplitude of the energy deficit? And I'm sure if I would have asked you before we started this discussion whether or not you thought that faster weight loss was worse for you, a lot of people would have said, yeah, faster weight loss is actually worse because you have all these side effects, one of which may actually be this the greater depression of energy expenditure, which would in fact kind of be a survival mechanism. So I guess the question is, are metabolic adaptation an on and off switch, or are they dimmered according to the value or the amount of energy restriction that you have? So if we look at this literature, and I will tell you, as far as the rate of weight loss and adaptations or the weight loss or any outcomes, there's not a lot out there. There were a lot of popular beliefs around this, but if you actually start digging and looking for some of this data, it's simply not there. This is one of the first papers in my understanding, or to my knowledge, that has shown this. So this is from the group of Kevin Hall, and what they basically did here, they show this really nice relationship between the metabolic adaptation and the energy imbalance. So the greater your metabolic adaptation, the greater the decrease away or the distance from your actual measure of energy expenditure, or at least what it should be based on calculations. So that was the first one, and then we published a paper with Jessica, who was sitting in the room a few years ago, I think in 2015, basically looking at similar parameters, and we show the same thing. So we have here the changes, and to be honest with you, it's in there because I think Kevin actually reviewed the paper and forced us to put it in the paper. I didn't really agree, but when you want to get something published, you do what the reviewer tells you. And that's not even a joke, Jess? Yeah. So in the end, we basically show the same thing. So it seems to be somewhat a protected phenomenon when you look at it, when you've got two different cohorts, not tied whatsoever, and you're seeing the same thing. But what I think previous authors have failed to mention is that if you look at the energy balance or imbalance and you correlate it with the changes in mass, you get an even better relationship. What I'm trying to say here, if you're looking at metabolic adaptations, given the relationship between body weight and energy expenditure, it's really, and the relationship between the energy imbalance and the weight loss, it's really hard to tease out which is which. So is metabolic adaptation greater because they're losing more weight, or they're losing more weight because they're more severely energy deprived? So how do you tease out these two factors? And I'm privileged to supervise another student. I think she's sitting at the back now. We decided to come up with a design that would try to address this question. So trying to get the same amount of weight through different types of weight loss. The same overall energy restriction, but spread out over 10 weeks versus 20 weeks. And that's the initial intent of this trial, where we had I'm sorry, but this pointer is really not working well. We had a slow weight loss for 20 weeks at minus 500 calories a day, and a fast weight loss at 1,000 calories a day for 10 weeks. So the overall deficit for both groups is the same. The overall weight loss should be the same, and the only difference is the daily magnitude of the deficit, which should have impacted the metabolic adaptations to a greater extent. So this is the outcome, and this, I must admit, these are preliminary results, but what we have is we do get similar weight losses, and again, my pointer's seemingly not doing very well. So we do get similar weight losses between the two groups, 6.7 and 5.4 within the 10 weeks, more severely restricted, and the 20 weeks, or the more severely and the less severely restricted, and we get very similar changes in energy expenditure. So it's not a perfect design, but at this point, I'm very tempted to conclude that it's an on and off switch. I don't think that there's a lot of modulations of metabolic adaptations based on the severity of the deficit, based on this data. And I could come back next year and tell you something entirely different when we have more subjects in the cohort, but at this point, I don't think that there is any modulation of the amplitude of the deficit. And this is kind of supported in a way by this study that was published a few years ago by a group out of Australia, and they did a head-to-head comparison between rapid and slow weight loss. And again, with the idea of that rapid weight loss you'd be worst off in the weight loss phase. And what you see is that, you've got the rapid in the red and the gradual weight loss. This is the entire weight loss for the group, very similar, and you see their rebound at 2 years later. And, does it really matter if you lose weight slowly or quickly? From a metabolic standpoint, I don't think it's the case. And if you actually look at clinical outcomes, like what you see in this particular slide, it seems to be the same. Am I close to my time? Excellent. So my conclusions. So, and this was from an editorial, weight loss slow and steady does not win the race. Like there's seemingly no differences between the two. And my conclusion, at least from the energy expenditure standpoint, is that a reduction of resting energy expenditure is an unsurmountable reality of weight loss. And I think if anything, and whether or not the metabolic adaptations exist or they don't, the reality is if you lose weight, your weight loss goes down. So any adaptations of your diet or your physical activity that you do is not a quick fix. It's something that will have to be there for the rest of your life if you want to maintain weight stability in the reduced weight state. And this is probably one of the most complicated things to do. Metabolic adaptations, I would argue, and I've not mentioned this, but I'd like to state this. When we started doing this, and people had done this before us as well, there were few groups. Now, if you look at this literature, many groups across the world are reporting very similar findings from different cohorts, different countries, different types of populations. So the metabolic adaptation, so the greater than predicted decrease, seems to be something. Whether or not it exists, that's something else, but it's consistently reported across different groups across the world. So there's many things now. And I think whether or not it's a metabolic adaptation or you want to call it what it is, which is, in my view, a greater than predicted decrease in energy expenditure, it's there. And in the end, I would say that neither the reduction in resting energy expenditure or the metabolic adaptation seem to be modulated by the extent of the energy deficit when changes in mass are similar. And I'll be happy to answer or entertain any questions that you may have. Thank you.
The potential modulators may be in terms of that difference between predicted and what we're actually.
There's been, a few studies that were done. The one that comes to mind, and I'm always tentative when I mention this, is one by the group of Rudy Leibel and Michael Rosenbaum, where they replenished leptin post-weight loss. And what they were able to do, exogenous injections, basically. So replacing what you'd lost because you have less white adipose tissue, at least mass-wise. And they were able to basically reestablish close to baseline values in resting energy expenditure with this. Now, in my understanding, unless I've missed some of this literature, this is the only study. The other studies that I've seen are studies in and around thyroid function, catecholamine excretion, that was published as well. So, and one interesting one is organ work, which could explain some of these metabolic adaptations. Because as you know, and I don't want to be giving you a lecture about the components of resting energy expenditure, but skeletal muscle mass at rest is a minor contributor to overall energy expenditure. Most of it is coming from organ work, and especially the myocardium, so the heart. One of the things you see when people lose weight is a reduction in resting heart rate. So that could be one thing. Liver function, kidney function. So all these things could actually contribute, and it's really hard to measure live, obviously, but there's been work, again, using MRI, so imagery, looking at mass of the different organs, and they actually seem to predict more of this change than the actual changes in the entire lean mass. So, I'm just guessing here, and somebody might not agree with what I'm saying, but overall, this is, I think, but we know we've not put the finger on the actual factors that if we had, then we could at least partly correct. You wouldn't correct the changes in mass, but you could correct some of the metabolic adaptations, maybe, yes. Thank you for the question, Stasha. Oh.
We're 5 minutes behind, and maybe if we could please
I went over?
save those questions for afterwards, that'd be fantastic. Maybe we'll have time at the end to have a
Okay,
general
sorry.
discussion. No, it's okay. Yeah, it's the entire. So thank you very much, Dr. Doucette, for that very clear and fascinating talk. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Bohan Lofvi, who obtained his PhD in physiology in the Ukraine in 2001, and in 2011 he joined Mount St. Vincent University and is now an associate professor there. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lavi.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to present today at this conference, and thanks organizers for inviting me. My talk will be about food intake and some examples from our recent studies at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. Here you can see my research grants. I don't have any commercial interest and any conflict of interest to declare, and I don't perceive any biases either. We all know that food intake, energy intake has increased in the past few decades. Also, we know that the obesity rate and diabetes is on the rise in Canada, so I will not be focusing on these statistical data. Food intake has very complex regulation, and there are many systems involved in this regulation. As you can see, we can divide all regulatory signals to central and peripheral. Central signals represented by centers in the brain, in the cortex, in the hypothalamus, and in brainstem. And peripheral signals represented by stretch receptors in stomach and gastrointestinal peptide hormones released in response to food intake and reaching brain centers and affecting energy intake. Also, nutrients that are digested and absorbed also reach bloodstream and affect energy intake as well. The example would be glucose or some amino acids. Here you can see different peripheral factors that responsible for food intake, and we can see here long-term factors such as insulin, for example, and leptin and adiponectin, and short-term factors such as peptide YY, tyrosine, oxyntomodulin, ghrelin, the only known orexigenic peptide that stimulate food intake, pancreatic polypeptides, glucagon-like peptide 1, and cholecystokinin, CCK. So all of them play a role in the regulation of food intake. Now, in how these peptide hormones can reach brain centers, we know that there is a strong blood-brain barrier exists. So there are two areas in the brain, median eminence, which is located in the base of hypothalamus, and area postrema that is located in medulla oblongata in the brainstem, that have weaker blood-brain barrier, and therefore those peptides can reach those brain centers, mostly in brainstem or in hypothalamus. And in hypothalamus, you can see different neuropeptides that have either orexigenic or anorexigenic effect. And those centers are interacting with higher centers, such as with cortex and limbic system, and that's how food intake either initiated or suppressed. Now, we have some interesting science conducted on a taste and food intake. And just to remind you that taste buds, there are different 4 types of taste buds on the tongue, and those 4 types of papilla on the tongue, and 3 of them contain taste buds and can detect tastings, stimuli, and those tastings you can see, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, and salty, and 1 type of papilla responsible for detecting changes in the texture of the food. And each taste bud contain taste receptors, and those taste receptors, they are responsible for each separate taste stimuli. However, all these receptors are located in 4 types of cells that are present in each of these 3 types of papilla. Now, you might see in some textbooks this tongue map on the left, showing that there are different zonations on the tongue responsible for different tastings, for different stimuli, and it's not supported anymore, as each taste bud contain all types of taste receptors. Now, what is interesting, we see in recent decade, is the discovery in taste receptors. And I highlighted here these 2 bitter taste receptors and sweet taste receptors that were discovered in gastrointestinal tract, so far away from oral cavity. And what is the role of those taste receptors? We don't know exactly yet, but it was a very interesting study conducted with 15 participants, and those 15 participants had the catheter from up to the duodenum, and those different tastings or the combination were used to see the effect on subsequent food intake. And what is interesting that in terms of appetite, the combination of sweet and umami tastings reduce desire to eat. And as for food intake, the combination of tastings could reduce food intake compared to placebo, right? So even targeting those taste receptors in gastrointestinal tract may help to reduce food intake. And again, that's a very interesting trend that we will see in the next several years, how these taste receptors in gastrointestinal tract may modulate various metabolic responses. So there are 2 major events, satiation and satiety. Satiation is the termination of food intake within a meal, and satiety as the feeling of fullness between 2 consecutive meals. And you can see satiety cascade, where different factors that presented that can affect energy intake, affect food intake. Now, what would be the best strategy to reduce food intake through the food approach? First one would be to reduce the energy in the food using the same volume or the same mass, the same weight. The second approach would be to amplify satiety signals in this food, such as adding certain ingredients, etc. Right? The question is, what is most effective, food or drugs? And the answer would be drugs, right? As you can see, that drugs can lead to reduction of food intake by 25% over the day, and food only by 3-4%, and over the day, 24 hours. However, if we consider risk and benefits, as you can see, most of those pharmaceutical appetite suppressants have serious adverse effects, and including psychiatric effects and the effects on cardiovascular system. So from those appetite suppressants in the red frame, none of them approved in Health Canada. Now, what is approved? You can see Saxenda, which is liraglutide, used for type 2 diabetes. It's analog of GLP-1, and 97% identical, produced through recombinant Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast, and used as the injection, skin injection. And as you can see, the company showed that it's helped to regulate appetite, right? However, you also can see different risk effects related to this drug, and of course, these risk effects might be considered before taking this medication. Now, the safe way to improve metabolic parameters would be to use, for example, pulses. Yesterday, Dr. Goran Zilo gave great presentation on pulses, so that's just some addition to that. We did the study with Heinz beans, baked beans, and we gave overweight and obese participants 5 cups of baked beans over 4-week period, and we found improvement in anthropometric and metabolic parameters, including waist circumference, LDL cholesterol, and blood glucose. However, if we look at the data on energy intake, you can see that over 1 month, it didn't change significantly. Only we see that fiber intake has increased. Anyway, those metabolic parameters improvements are very important. Food industry and consumers, they interested to see satiety-related health claims in food, and some considerations that must be taken before doing any health claim, whether a single food intake can, for instance, translate to the subsequent food intake, whether it can translate to the 24-hour food intake, whether it can translate finally to reduction in body weight. And in 2012, Health Canada produced a draft document on satiety health claims, and as you can see, those claims are functional claims, meaning that intended for people to improve or maintain normal physiological function. Those health claims must be based on human clinical trials, not on animals. Then those health claims are based on appetite reduction, not on energy intake reduction. And the benefit of that is that some consumers are interested to control their food intake, so that's the purpose of the claim, to inform them. And biomarkers such as those hormones I mentioned before not considered. And most importantly, that the effect should be seen in 1 serving of the food, a serving shown on nutrition fact table. So the important question we have, whether reduction of appetite always predetermine the reduction of food intake? And the answer is no. We did the study just recently presented as experimental biology in Chicago. My student Heidi Stirling completed this study using buckwheat and couscous. Buckwheat contain dihydroinositol that shown to reduce blood glucose, and buckwheat has a low glycemic index, and couscous is highly processed grain product that has a higher medium glycemic index. So the hypothesis would be, was that buckwheat would help to reduce food intake. So we had adults come into the lab after overnight fast. We gave them 300 kilocalories treatment of either couscous or buckwheat, or we gave them water control, 0 calories. What we found that both buckwheat and couscous reduce subjective appetite compared to control. However, this didn't translate to reduced food intake 2 hours later, right? So we did another study with young females using granola cereals, where we added either Greek yogurt or coconut fermented product. And what we found that both cereals, either with yogurt, which was high in protein, or with coconut dessert, which was high in fiber, reduced subjective appetite compared to water control. And most importantly, we found that it's reduced food intake in 2 hours. So in this case, appetite reduction could predict the food intake reduction. And here we found also the benefits of Greek yogurt on blood glucose control as well. So the question was then, how much protein, for instance, is needed to reduce food intake? And we did this study before in U of T, showing that doses of whey protein between 20 and 40 grams can reduce food intake. And doses between 10 and 40 can reduce blood glucose, and the insulin response will be lower as to the same doses of glucose. Also, we found that whey protein compared to glucose reduce stomach emptying. So here is the summary, and basically food intake regulation is very complex, and the effects of food might be determined by the dose of the nutrients, the interaction, food texture, and food matrix that is there. Thank you, and we'll take any questions.
Thanks. We have time for one question. Okay, so I'll take the chair's prerogative, and I'm going to ask you a selfish question then. So if the composition of the food doesn't seem to affect food intake later on, what do you suggest is the practical message for people trying to create weight loss diets?
Well, we know that the combination of nutrients such as protein and fiber can certainly lead to food intake reduction. And then the texture of the food is important too. For instance, high viscosity can also lead to reduced food intake. So all these factors need to be counted, and actually they accounted for functional food design that can, for example, lead to stomach distension, producing gastrointestinal hormones, suppressing appetite, and providing feeling of fullness for even 30 up to 2 hours.
Thanks for that. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Carla Prado. She is an assistant professor at the University of Alberta in Canada and a Campus Alberta Innovates Chair in Nutrition, Food and Health. She is the director of the Human Nutrition Research Unit, a state-of-the-art research and training facility. The focus of her current research program is to develop targeted nutrition interventions for the prevention and treatment of sarcopenic obesity in patients with diverse chronic conditions. Please welcome Dr. Prado to the podium.
Apparently I can't close the slides. Yeah. I'm a Mac person, so. Anyways, like Eric, I'm also not a morning person. But unlike Eric, I may speak a foreign language, so I'm gonna try to pay attention to that so that I don't go start speaking something else. Okay, so it should be, there you go. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about defining and measuring sarcopenic obesity. I've listed all my grant supports on my last slide. These are some of my disclosures. Nonetheless, I will not be mentioning any commercial medications or treatments where conflict of interest applies. So when we talk about sarcopenic obesity, we're really talking about body composition, so looking beyond the unit of body weight and looking at the different proportions of lean versus fat tissue in that unit of body weight. So you're going to notice here today I'm going to talk a little bit about, maybe I'll point it here, but skeletal muscle, lean soft tissue, and fat-free mass. So the skeletal muscle is the primary compartment of lean soft tissue. If you plug in bone mineral density, you have fat-free mass. So I'm going to be using these terms interchangeably. They are different, but when we talk about sarcopenia, overall what it means is that depletion of these compartments. So sarcopenia is this term that has been originally used to define the loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength that occurs with aging. So it has been primarily studied in the elderly. And people with sarcopenia, they present with increased health risks for functional status, so for example, disability, falls, and fractures. There's truly a variety of other things that are associated with sarcopenia as well. Now, when we talk about sarcopenia, most healthcare professionals have the idea of someone looking like that, so very frail, a very small BMI. So if I were to show this image and say, you know, between these two individuals, one of them have sarcopenia, perhaps most people would think that it's this person on the right that has, so a person with the lower BMI that has sarcopenia, but the truth is when you look at their body composition, this person with a BMI of 18.5 actually is quite muscular, and it is the person with obesity who has sarcopenia. So that's what we call sarcopenic obesity. So the issue is sarcopenia is a hidden condition, so people can have exactly the same body weight, but very different proportions of lean versus fat tissue. So they can have, you know, they can be quite muscular, or you can have someone looking like that, so that has a very large amount of body weight, but the lean mass is not proportional to that body weight. So sarcopenic obesity is what we call the confluence of two epidemics, because we have the increasing life expectancy, so people are living longer, but we also have the obesity epidemic. So the prevalence of this condition is likely to be dramatic in the next decade. And I like to say that sarcopenic obesity is a new face of an old problem, because we have long acknowledged the issue of both sarcopenia and obesity, but nonetheless, only recently, actually the past 10 years alone, that we were able to identify this condition and study its health consequences. So the problem with that is that we believed, and that's actually true for the majority of people with obesity, that because of carrying that excess body weight, because of gravity, that has an impact on muscle. But a proportion of people who are obese, they become obese without a parallel increasing muscle mass and incrementing muscle strength, and that's where sarcopenic obesity develops, and that's somehow related to an impaired adaptive physiological mechanisms that we are yet to understand. But the issue is truly, it becomes quite tricky for us as healthcare professionals to identify this condition, because obesity masks sarcopenia. And I think it's very interesting that sarcopenic obesity can actually explain the obesity paradox. And the obesity paradox tells us that contrary to what we believe of obesity leading to worse clinical outcomes, in certain clinical conditions, individuals with obesity can present with a survival advantage over their counterparts. And that's why we call it the paradox or reverse epidemiology. And that has been reported in people with cancer, heart failure, especially cardiovascular disease, a lot of literature on that, and COPD as well. Now, the issue with the obesity paradox research is that the majority of papers have only considered BMI when they are defining obesity and studying the obesity paradox. But as I've mentioned before, you can have people with exactly the same BMI, but very different proportions of lean and adipose tissue. And we were contacted by the Journal of Current Opinion in Nutrition and Metabolism, and they asked us if we wanted to write a review on the obesity paradox, but trying to explain that in the context of body composition phenotypes. So we took on the challenge, and if you're familiar with this journal, we can only look at review papers that have been published in the past 18 months prior to the publication. So we were able to retrieve 71 articles, so very hot topic, right? Now the problem is that less than 10% of these articles were in fact measuring body composition. And for the ones that were measuring body composition, what we found was that when lean mass was considered, the excess body weight was not conferring a protective effect. So it was, in fact, low lean mass that was leading to the worst prognostic outcomes. So in the case of this figure here, it's the person that has further on the right, that has a lot of muscle mass or a lot of lean mass that was living longer. And the person with lower lean mass was having a shorter survival. So in these studies, BMI was confounding the association between low lean mass and survival. And we don't have time to go over all the etiology of sarcopenic obesity, but these are some of the hypothesized mechanisms. So a lot of interrelationship between adipose tissue and skeletal muscle that are ultimately leading to greater losses of muscle mass and increments in adipose tissue. So truly, the bottom line is that it is a vicious cycle, so one reinforces the other here. And we have some hypothetical metabolic scenarios that we can imagine that our clients that can lead to sarcopenic obesity in our clients. Let me see if I can get this to work. Can you see it? I can see. Anyways, so, okay. Can you see the mouse? No, okay. Anyway, so we can have a person with normal weight, and this person can actually gain weight and gain enough lean mass that this person only becomes obese, or on the other end of the slide, we can have a person gaining weight, but they don't gain enough lean mass, so this person can become sarcopenic obese. And on the other end, we can have a person with morbid obesity losing weight, but not enough to change BMI category, so being still in the obesity category. And this person may lose weight, but become only obese, or they can lose a lot of lean tissue, so disproportional losses of lean mass in terms of adipose tissue loss, and become sarcopenic obese. Now, in terms of sarcopenic obesity diagnosis, I think that the primary issue that we have studying this condition is this lack of a unanimous view on the criteria that we have, because now we have to define not only obesity, but we also have to define sarcopenia. And I joke that people are willing to kill each other over the definition of sarcopenia, so it's quite tricky, and it's true. Like, if you've been to these conferences. Anyways, so there I am trying to fight it. But anyways, I think that's a major research and clinical drawback. And truly, the criteria is somewhat arbitrary. It is study-specific. And the bottom line is that this jeopardizes our ability to identify the health implications of this condition. And I truly believe that the criteria is probably study, or at least population-specific or cohort-specific. We can't have a one-size-fits-all. And if we have time later, we can talk about the WHO recently recognition of sarcopenia as a condition. So we have ICD-10 codes for sarcopenia now, but we don't have a way to define it that is a unanimous definition. So I don't have time to go over that, but this is just to list a number of diagnostic criteria using different methodologies. So people have used less than 2 standard deviation below that of healthy younger people. Or they have used quantile, so the lowest tertile, to define sarcopenia, or they can use data-driven approach, so looking at a clinical outcome of interest and the cut point that is leading to that outcome, for example, mortality. Some other cut points, obviously, when you're talking about body composition, it has absolutely to be sex-specific. And we are all aware of the variety of obesity diagnoses that were there. BMI is still here because once you have measurements of muscle mass, you can eliminate people that are muscular and have a BMI because of that, but percent body fat as well is used a lot. Now, as you see, people can use any of this, a combination of these criteria. So what that leads to is that of a great variability of the prevalence of sarcopenic obesity in the literature. And this is data from an NHANES, a study from Betsy's et al. That used the NHANES data, almost 5,000 people. So they've tested 8 definitions of sarcopenic obesity. So each of the lines in the graphs represent each of these definitions. But bottom line is that sarcopenic obesity prevalence was varying by a factor of 19 in men and 26 in women. So huge variability, and that translated to a prevalence ranging from anywhere from 4% to 84% in men and almost 4% to 94% in women. So huge prevalence, huge variability. And we attempted to create a cut points, but we were trying to create a way to define abnormalities in body composition, again using data from NHANES because it's a population representative data set. And what we've done is we've considered not only sex in the definition of cut points, but we considered age because obviously the body composition phenotype of people change as they age, but also BMI. You cannot define sarcopenia in a person with a BMI of 40 compared to a person with a BMI of 18, right? Of course, the person with a larger body weight is going to have a higher amount of lean mass. So the cut points, at least for lean mass, have to be different. So what we've done is we've used this sophisticated statistical approach to create Z-scores of specific deciles that were sex, age, and BMI specific in almost over 13,000 subjects aged 18 years and older. So we've classified people into 4 phenotypes based on the DEXA measured amount of lean mass from arms and legs, so we call it appendicular muscle, and fat mass. So people could be classified into the normal quadrant, the high fat mass quadrant, which is the obese-like quadrant, the low mass, which is the sarcopenic-like, and the low lean mass and high fat mass, which is the sarcopenic obese-like phenotype. So I'm only going to show data from the low lean mass and high fat mass today. So here's a graph that showcases this prevalence of low lean mass with high fat mass phenotype in underweight, normal weight. We had to combine them because of sample size issues, overweight, obese, and all. So we can even look at the obese prevalence among men and women and all prevalence combined. So what we found here is, remember the way we were trying to define this prevalence of this abnormal phenotype was that, first of all, it was not an age-related condition. We observed that across the age spectrum, and also it was observed across the BMI spectrum. So very interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have data yet on the clinical outcomes or health outcomes of this phenotype, but our first paper is just being circulated, and we're trying to look at survival first of all, but we're looking at cardiovascular diseases as well. But truly, at the end of the day, sarcopenic obesity, as I'm going to talk about later, is the worst case scenario. So, I'm going to talk about now. Clinical implications of sarcopenic obesity. So very, very briefly, again, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about everything. If you were in my talk today, I only have a couple of slides that are the same, and these are data from Carleen Johnson-Stoklosa's master's thesis, and she's here today. And Carleen looked at the DEXA scans that were collected as part of an initial visit to the obesity specialty clinic in Edmonton. And these were obtained as part of clinical assessment, thanks to Dr. Sharma. And these individuals were class 2 and 3 obesity. So what we did is we really opportunistically retrieved this data from their medical records, and we were able to collect body composition data in 120 people. And their mean age, as you can see there, is 46. So they were quite young. We're not talking about elderly individuals having sarcopenia here. and a mean BMI of 44.7. So here we see the distribution of lean mass obtained by DEXA scans and a body mass index in these individuals. And of course, these variables are correlated, but I want to challenge you to look the other way around and look at the variability in lean mass in people who have exactly the same BMI. And in this example here, we have people with a BMI of around 40, but with a 30 kilograms difference in the amount of lean mass. So that's huge difference, and of course that has clinical implications. So Carlene was able to identify 25% of these individuals as having the sarcopenic obesity phenotype, and sarcopenic obesity in this cohort was associated with higher triglycerides, the use of antihypertensive medications, inactivity, and greater self-reported difficulties with activities of daily living. Now, when we talk about activities of daily living, we're talking about not only quality of life, but we're also talking about the ability of people to be independent. And here we see all of the items for difficulties with activities of daily living that these individuals were experiencing, comparing the sarcopenic obese and the obese phenotypes, and you can see the ones that were statistically different. So again, a variety of items of difficulty with activity of daily living. They were independent, that was independent of multimorbidity, that was independent of age and sex. So as you can see, it is a problem. Remember the mean age of these individuals, so it's quite striking. This is data from a fairly recent paper published looking at a meta-analysis of sarcopenic obesity related to all-cause mortality. So this is data from 12 prospective studies, over 35,000 people with 14,000 deaths. And what they reported was a 24% increase in risk of survival, shorter survival if you were sarcopenic obese. So we all know the consequences of obesity. Now what we have to do is combine the consequences of sarcopenia, and that is why it is a double burden of these conditions. And what the literature has shown us is that at the end of the day, sarcopenic obesity is associated with physical disability. These people have decreasing functional performance. They also have increased risk of osteoarthritis, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, increased length of hospital stay, and increasing mortality. So it is associated with greater morbidity and disability than either sarcopenia or obesity in isolation. And I can't possibly talk about the countermeasures for this condition in one slide, but obviously here it is a multifactorial syndrome, so we do need a multifactorial approach. So I think that we do have to talk about energy and nutrient intake. As I've talked about in my talk yesterday, the protein to energy ratio should be specific by the type of body composition that people have and not being adjusted by kilogram of body weight. Strength training may be a very good ally, as well as cardiovascular exercise programs. And I think that at the end of the day, we may also see some help from therapeutic approaches, perhaps the use of SARM or other medications, we don't know yet. The literature is still limited to elderly individuals. There is one article that has been published highlighting the benefits of behavioral intervention, nutrition, and exercise in elderly individuals. They adhere to that fairly well, actually, but we don't have time to talk about all of that today. So in conclusion, sarcopenic obesity is a hidden condition, undetectable by measuring body weight alone. It may explain the obesity paradox. Its diagnosis is complex, and we still don't have an agreed upon criteria. And sarcopenic obesity is related to greater morbidity and disability than either condition alone. Thank you very much. We have time for questions? One question? And if you have to run, I will be happy to answer questions here at the front.
Perfect presentation, thank you very much. Measuring by DEXA is obviously very challenging, and you can't do that in the clinical setting easily. BIA, the variability is there, oftentimes, but that's really challenging. Would resting metabolic rate be helpful? If someone has a lower resting metabolic rate than what they're predicted, could part of that be a sarcopenic component?
I think the resting metabolic rate is a good ally. Nonetheless, it may be masked by inflammation and other factors as well. So I like to advocate for them, and I talked a little bit about that yesterday, the measurement of body composition. I say that every medical field has evolved into using sophisticated techniques, but we have to rely on what Hippocrates could have measured, which is measurements of body weight. Now, with the DEXA scans, for example, they are everywhere because we're measuring osteoporosis. BIA, so I think, of course, it's not a reality. I don't want to, but I think that this is what we have to push for. There is this variability, and we can't have a one-size-fits-all nutritional recommendations. We can put them in terms of assessment as well of their health and status. BIA, what I've said yesterday is BIA is a problem for people with BMI greater than 34, for sure, but especially newer techniques now, BIA is an issue if you're using it for a cross-sectional assessment, but when you're looking at it it changes over time, so instead of taking a picture, making a film, it becomes quite a good ally. That's a quote from a colleague, Dr. Cristina Gonzalez. And one thing that we are seeing more and more in clinical studies is ultrasound. So ultrasound is fairly cheap. I joke that people can have a bake sale and buy one to measure body composition, and there's some protocols being developed. The degree of compressibility of the skin is an issue, but we have a lot of protocols being developed now to use that to assess skeletal muscle mass in people with obesity as well. So I think that especially now we have so much momentum with WHO recognizing sarcopenia as an issue to acquire these techniques and actually to move beyond to try to implement them in the settings. But and we can talk to Eric about that, but I think that the RMR can be masked by other, especially if you have comorbid conditions present in your patient, that may be masked by inflammation or something else. So I guess I'll be here if you have questions.
Thank you very much again for that really excellent presentation. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, and Dr. Cook and I would like to thank all four of our speakers this morning for truly excellent presentations. And I think all four of our speakers will be around to answer any further questions you might have. So please feel free to come on up here and ask them any questions you might have before we have our health break. So thank you again to all the speakers and to you for attending.